you may be charged with discrimination. And if you take a look at some companies and some of the things I've seen done, some of those decisions are discriminatory. So I would recommend that if you find yourself in a position in an organization and you have a pay scale, unless you have a practice or policy that says that you have a training wage that is below the minimum of your scale, that you always hire at the minimum.
Because basically you're setting this pay range to say it is for people who have the skills to do this job that we're hiring for. So it's rather illogical to say, well, they don't really quite have the skills. Okay, that's the entry level of this job, and this is the job you're paying. So I can't see why companies hire below the minimum, but I guess they have their reasons. And hopefully they move folks rapidly up there, but yeah, unfortunately it is totally the company's decision, although, as you said, there can be discriminatory issues if they're not applying it consistently.
Mm-hmm. I've seen HR's job here in the last few years is to try to keep managers from going above that midpoint. Just there's so much talent out there right now that you can pretty much get your pick of the litter. Mm-hmm. Most of these folks have high salaries. And in that case, HR will try to keep them around that midpoint because that's going to affect their future ability to make any money. Plus, you don't want people bumping all over each other. And that's been my struggle, is holding them back.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. Because for the key talent, and we had a lot of that in one of the organizations I worked in, and it's basically because, and it's probably what you have, you don't have time to train people. You're hiring only the ones that are already fully experienced at the job. So if they're already fully experienced at the job, and hey, ideally you're hiring a high performer because that's what you want in your organization. And there's actually a slide later on, but we may skip over it at that point, that says, you know, your folks who are developing in the role are somewhere between minimum and midpoint. Folks who are fully competent in the role are somewhere around the midpoint. And folks who are highly experienced and high performers can go all the way to the maximum. Well, and we've already said this midpoint is set at where the marketplace is for a fully competent person, not necessarily the highly experienced high performer. If you're trying to hire the highly experienced high performer who's paid up here at their current organization, why are they going to come and work for you down at that level? And so, yeah, it's a challenge. We used to, way back when, had a rule that you could only hire folks in below, they couldn't be above 90%. You had to hire in between 80 and 90%. Well, it's just ridiculous because we were always trying to hire experience.
Question, like the employee that you're hiring, would they know what the maximum is? Or do we have to tell them? Or?
No, you certainly don't have to tell them. And
how
that,
do they know if you were below the minimum?
And it depends, again, entirely on your organization. I've worked in an organization where we, up to the level of director and above, we shared every pay range and grade for every job. We posted all the jobs in the organization. So even if your new hire off the street isn't told what the pay range is, they could be in your place one day and you could post another job like that and they could see what the range was, so you're not hiding it. So I've actually been in an organization where all of that was shared openly. Most of the companies I work with are nowhere near getting to that point. They don't want to share the ranges with their employees. So yeah, most new hires in most companies and most employees in most companies, they wouldn't really know. And the only way you're going to find out is, you know, employees talk a lot more than they used to a couple decades ago. And you never know for sure if what the other person's telling you is accurate or not, but that's really a lot of how people are going to find out about it now. Most companies still don't publish the information. Any other questions? Talk a little bit about this line up here, and it says 50% range spread, because I kind of just want to get through this structure just a little bit here. Spread is the spread from the maximum to the minimum. And in the typical scenario, 20% below midpoint, 20% above midpoint, as we used in this example, what that means is it delivers a range spread of 50%, because 120,000 is 50% greater than 80,000, so it's the maximum divided by the minimum, tells you what the range spread is. The only reason that that kind of has become a key term is that there is a sort of best practice theory out there now. Before, companies would just, with all of their pay ranges in their pay structure, use this same 50% range spread, the 80-20 scenario. What the new sort of best practice theory is that you should vary your range spreads. So, for example, if we look at this next range, this one says it has a 52% range spread. That means maximum here divided by the minimum down there. This is 52% higher than that one. What the theory is on this new sort of best practice thing about variable range spreads, it says that at your lowest level jobs, your range spread, so the maximum divided by minimum, should only be maybe around 30%, possibly even a bit less. So that's a whole lot less than 50%. And so you start out sort of maybe around 30% range spread at your lowest level jobs, and it steadily increases, kind of like this one's doing in the little version here, to where by the time you get to your management level jobs, the range spread can be 60% or more, maybe even as high as like 65%, something like that. So the folks at the top end have a much bigger range of salaries to operate within, which means they've got a lot more room to keep getting pay raises within their pay range than the folks down at the lower end. There is some logic for that if you think about it. You know, the idea that the people who are developing in their role are from minimum to midpoint. At the lower levels, typically the learning curve on those jobs is quite short, so you would expect to see people move from minimum to midpoint much more rapidly. They become fully experienced. The other thing is there's opportunities generally at lower levels for much more rapid promotions, whereas when you get folks into the highest levels of the organization, they have a long learning curve, they tend to stay in the job a lot longer. There are very much fewer promotional opportunities. So that's the logic you can kind of see to why you would make those ranges wider at the higher salary levels. And I have yet to actually go into a company where I've actually seen them use variable range spreads. So even though that's like the best practice that's talked about now, and there's good logic to it, it's not really out there commonly yet in actual use. I have used it with some clients for whom I've built range pay structures, but I will say that I still build pay structures in the standard 50% range spread model where everything's, you know, 80-20. One of the reasons for that is, let's see, I'm going to jump ahead here. Are you familiar with the term compa ratio? Not yet. Okay. What compa ratio is, as it shows here, the calculation of compa ratio is you take the employee's salary and you divide it by the midpoint of their pay range. So if in that previous example the employee's salary is $100,000 and their midpoint's $100,000, they are at 100% of their compa ratio is 100%. Yeah. And if they're at the minimum, they're at 80%, and if they're at the top, they're at 120%. If you divide their salary by the midpoint. So that's what compa ratio is, and it's an easy way to go, okay, if the salary divided by the midpoint is less than 80%, then they're below the minimum. And if the salary divided by the midpoint is more than 120%, they're above the maximum. And of course, anywhere in between, you can see how they're progressing toward their midpoint. And that's if you use a consistent 50% range spread, compa ratio very easily, of course, shows you who's below minimum, who's above maximum, and how close they are to those, because it's all consistent. As I said, 80%, 120. If you use variable range spreads, the difference from maximum to minimum, or from minimum to midpoint, midpoint to maximum, varies. We just said it was a variable range spread, which means that if you look at your compa ratio, 80% may be nowhere near the minimum. 120% may be nowhere near the maximum. Just depends on where they are in terms of the range spread for their particular job. So the reason I have with some clients used the standard old 50% range spread and not the new latest greatest variable is it's too complicated to explain to these organizations or for them to administer variable range spreads. What you have to do in lieu of using the compa ratio, you'd use a different calculation, range penetration. What range penetration actually tells you is how far has the person progressed through their range. So if they're at the minimum, they've progressed 0% through the range. If they're at the maximum, they've progressed 100% through the range. So it's a very different look than the compa ratio. And as you can see, there's the formula for range penetration. And it's not nearly so straightforward trying to explain that one to an unsophisticated client who's never done anything with compensation before. So I have very mixed feelings. I know, theoretically I know what the best practices are supposed to be. Do I think it really, is the best thing for a lot of the organizations? I don't. And I don't know if it's really going to go forward and catch on or not. I just don't know. Because it's more complicated to explain. And there's a lot of organizations out there who are not sophisticated in their compensation practices. So that can be a real stretch. Let me think. I think I want to go back to when we were at before. Let's see. All right, the one other thing, I wanted to go back to this one, is there's one other piece we haven't talked about yet, and it is this piece in the middle, 15% midpoint to midpoint. When you're building your pay structure, it's also very important that you look at the distance. This is called the distance between your midpoints, and you really need to pay attention to the distance between your midpoints. The reason why you need to pay attention to that, I think it was actually touched on in the conversation a little bit earlier, is you want to make sure that when you are promoting people, for example, you want to make sure if you're taking someone from up here in this pay range and promoting them to the next pay range, you don't want them to be so far up in their next pay range that they don't have a whole lot of opportunity for pay increases. Ideally, you want to take somebody from this range and with their normal promotional increase, put them somewhere down here so they can see, I've got opportunities for pay increases for a lot of years to come. That's a very motivating situation to be in. You don't want to go from the maximum of this one to practically the maximum here and go, great, I'll get one more pay increase and then I'm red circled again. So it's a matter of balancing these midpoints. The other side of it is you don't want to make the distance between them so big that when you take someone from, say, here in this pay range, that in order to get them to the minimum of your next pay range, that you have to give them like a 20% pay increase just to get to the minimum. So if you get those distances between the pay ranges too far, you got huge increases for huge promotional increases to have to do to get them in their range. If you make it too narrow, then you lose the motivation of them being able to go into the new range with room to still get pay increases. So that's where you got to pay attention to that when you're building your pay structure. I typically go somewhere between like 12 and 20% is the distance between my midpoints when I'm building a pay structure. It really depends on the organization. One of the things that it will depend on is how rapidly they want to promote. If it's an organization that wants to promote people very frequently, then obviously you want your distance between the pay ranges to be narrower because they're going to move up a lot faster. So you really have to look at, what your promotional practices are. That's one of the factors to look at in terms of that distance between midpoints. And the other thing is, in terms of figuring out how to build a pay structure, what I would typically look at, and there's a couple ways of going about it, is you've got a bunch of jobs and you've priced them all out. How do you actually, consolidate them into a pay structure? Typically what I will do is look at, I'll take a bunch of jobs, you'll end up with a bunch of different jobs. There's some kind of an accounting job, and there's some kind of an IT job, and there's some kind of an HR job. And the competitive salaries for those three very different jobs may be virtually identical. Maybe they all pay $50,000 a year. That's a logical cluster from which to start a pay range. I can say, look, I've got all these jobs that are centered around $50,000 a year. I'm going to make a pay range with the midpoint of $50,000 a year. And so that's a lot of what I will do, is take clusters of jobs. So to some extent, how you build your pay range can depend on the clusters of jobs you have, the distribution of competitive salaries that you've pulled from the salary survey data. And then it's a lot of mathematical stuff to kind of balance it out. You want to get close enough to matching those competitive salaries, but yet you want to be fairly consistent. You don't want to have like 7% distance from this grade to the next one, and then 20% to the next one, and then 10.
But can it change? Can you have 10 or 15%, like 10 or more,
oh, yeah.
15, or small changes, or 7 or 8% or whatever?
Yeah, in fact, to some extent too, it is not a bad idea to start out with them being closer at the bottom of the lower pay ranges, because again, those would be where promotions might happen more often, and to widen out as you get to the higher levels. I pretty much try not to sort of go, like 10, 7, 12, that kind of thing, but be fairly consistent. But if there's a variation, I will tend to make it that it's narrower at the bottom, at the lower level pay, bigger at the top.
Do we kind of mess ourselves up when you fill out an application and you list all the jobs you work and you list your pay range, and do we kind of set ourselves up to where they're going to start us off at?
I was like, that great question, of course, when you go into the interview. Well, what's your salary expectation? And again, it depends on the organization. But yeah, if you come in and say you'd be happy making $30,000 and that's the minimum of my pay range, hey, if you're happy with that, I might be happy with that. So yeah, to some extent, yeah. It could.
So what's the best response for that then?
Aim high?
I have to on me.
Oh, wow, absolutely. I do too. Nikki.
I've found that the best response to someone when they ask you that is one that they do not expect, because their expectation is that you're going to give them a number. Mm-hmm. My response to them usually is, should we mutually decide that we will work together, I'm sure that we will come to a fair decision on pay. And you know what? They never mention pay again until they're ready to make an offer. It lets them know that pay can be negotiable with you. It also lets them know, in spite of what may be true, is that pay is not going to make the difference on whether or not you take the job. That you are going to be looking at the entire job. And sometimes you really do take a job that pays you less because you're gonna enjoy it, or because of the opportunity